Download the AllStar app. Make your picks for UFC fights, challenge your friends, level up and win prizes. Link in description. Get it now. Chris Weidman, he has come out and expressed his frustrations with the UFC because he was not paid, or his pay is being withheld due to the cancellation of the fight. I think the fight was canceled on the day of the event, right?
Yeah, because his opponent had food poisoning, something like that.
Yeah,
They
so
postponed it to like UFC 310 instead of 309, I think it was.
Yeah, so like, this is what Chris Weidman is saying. They're gonna take care of me. They're doing something for me. I'm not getting my full purse. I'll put that out there, which it's tough. You show up and make weight. My show money is my win money. I have guaranteed money, so that was my point. I showed up. You guys had that on the budget sheet to begin with. You guys made a great night. Why do you guys keep that money and I don't? That was my thought. So basically, Chris Weidman, obviously he's making a lot of money per fight because he was a former champ. He's been with the UFC for a long time.
Right.
He's been a company man, so to say.
Mm-hmm.
Doing what the UFC needs, and he's an iconic figure due to the fact that he's the one who knocked out Anderson Silva.
That's right.
Right, and this is when Anderson Silva was acting pretty wild in that fight, right?
Yeah.
And he was a beast. Yes, he was like almost unstoppable, and that was like the turning point of his career, basically, as a champion.
Right.
But Weidman, he also does like a lot of TV work for the UFC.
Mm-hmm.
So he's on those like weigh-in shows, and he has a pretty good career after fighting.
True, yeah.
Doing all of that stuff.
That's right, yeah.
He has his own YouTube channel, all of that. But, that's not the point. The point is that Chris Weidman went through a camp, made weight,
right,
and he's not getting his full pay.
Mm.
And, when you look at the UFC, it's the number one organization in the world, and they're worth like, what is it, $12 billion or something like that right now?
Yeah, probably.
Around that.
Wouldn't surprise me.
And there's a budget for each event that covers every single fighter.
Mm.
And Chris Weidman is basically saying, if you have the budget, why are you not paying me?
Right. Yeah, that's true. Like, yeah, I wonder, because that's a weird one, because obviously if you're guaranteed payment, then you should get paid when you are supposed to get paid. That's pretty standard. And then, I guess, weirdly enough, right, on the other side of things, I guess because they postponed the fight, I wonder if the understanding just kind of shifted to, all right, well, since you're going to fight this person a little bit later, then that's when you're going to get paid, which doesn't seem right, but I can see the decision making like going in that direction. But yeah, so like if a fight gets postponed, right, when should the fighter get paid? Like on the initial like accepted date of the fight, or when the fight actually takes place? I hadn't actually thought about that before, because there are like quite a few postponed fights due to injuries or logistical stuff where, let's say, they fight a month later, but well, were they supposed to get paid? Like, so I don't know, what do you think about that? Should the one that's like not in the wrong with the postponement get paid on the initial agreed date of the fight, or should they just get paid like whenever the actual fight takes place?
It's a super gray area.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's almost like you're giving all the power to the UFC.
True.
Right? In that situation, in those types of situations where like it's one guy's, it's not really his fault, but due to his illness, the fight was canceled during fight week. I think it should be in the contracts. You know what I mean? Like the contract should say like, because they sign contracts for a reason.
Yeah.
Right? And it's to mostly, I think, to cover the UFC's ass.
Probably, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Think about it.
Right.
So, like, I think in the contract it should say, like, like let's say the fight is in 8 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever. You sign the contract, you know, you're fighting. Chris Weidman, he signs a contract, let's say 12 weeks ago, to fight Eric Anders at UFC 309, right? So once you sign the contract, in the contract, it should say, like, if my opponent pulls out in the middle of a training camp, which the fighter has invested tons of money into, especially this high level, right? Especially someone like Chris Weidman. Imagine how much money he spent in the past, you know what I mean? That just, you know, that accumulated to what he's doing right now, right? And he's earned his paychecks, right? He's earned his paydays. He's a former champion, you know what I mean? He's fought in some of the biggest fights. So it should be in the contract, like, let's say my opponent pulls out, I should be compensated if they don't find a new opponent to cover.
Right. Yeah.
It should be in the contract. Like, I wonder if it is in the contract, that there should be something there. This is what managers should be fighting for, right? Like, if you have a manager or an agent, you should be fighting for all of this stuff. This stuff should not be happening still to this day.
Yeah.
You're the UFC.
Right, because if you're at that level, it's also a logistical nightmare, right? Like, if you fly in training partners for a specific opponent, and now they've got to stay an extra month, damn, if they're that good at what they do, like, it's not going to be cheap to fly them in, you know, and just be like, hey, whatever your plans are, like, cancel them for the next 2 or 3 weeks. Like, that's a lot of people, potentially high profile, people with very valuable skills that also have to push their calendars back if they're even able to do that, right? Like, imagine, like, Frank Hickman's probably a good example where, like, he flies out, you know, every couple weekends, more or less, like, for a fighter. Like, imagine telling someone as busy as, let's say, like, or as professionally active as Craig Jones to, like, push back his schedule for 3 weeks or 4 weeks, right? Like, if he's got events or something lined up, well, he doesn't compete much anymore. But, like, if he's, you know, whatever ventures he's up to, whichever parts of the world he decides to go to, right now he's got to push it back. If, let's say, if Volk's opponent or whatever postpones for, like, 3 weeks.
Yeah.
So then, yeah, like, obviously, that doesn't necessarily mean the UFC is liable to cover the extra costs of bringing those people in to ensure, like, a great fight or whatever. But it definitely puts on more financial strain for the fighter because the fighter wants to be as prepared as possible. And then, you know, next thing you know, it's like, oh, all right, well, we don't have Craig, we don't have Frank for the 2 or 3 or 4 arguably most important weeks leading up to the fight. So yeah, I could see why it becomes a mess when things don't go, like, scheduled like that. Especially,
in the contract, it should say, like, okay, you know, if your opponent pulls out and you're in the middle of camp, they don't have a replacement for you to have the fight, to go and, you know, get paid.
Right.
You should get a certain percentage of your purse to cover the cost of training camp. Because some of these guys, like Chris Weidman, you know, like, I remember Rampage Jackson was talking about, this is like 8 years ago, and he was spending 6 figures on training camps.
I believe it.
Imagine if the fight was canceled during fight week and you spent 6 figures on a training camp, and then they tell you, oh, you're only going to get a portion of your purse.
Yeah, true. Imagine not getting paid at all.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
You just lost 6 figers. And you're bringing in, like, this coach for this, you know, like you mentioned Frank, like, for wrestling, for let's say your opponent is a heavy wrestler, you need to bring in training partners, because maybe you don't have the training partners that you need in your vicinity to prepare properly for your opponent. So you have to bring them in, house them, pay them, feed them. This gets expensive, right? It's not cheap to house people, you know what I mean? Like, especially in this sport where, you know, fighter pay is a big issue.
Absolutely.
And this is just another reason why fighter pay is a big issue, because fighters are not getting paid their contracted amount, right? It's in the contracts, because if it wasn't in the contract, the UFC wouldn't, you know, the UFC would be just like, it would backfire on them, basically. So it's got to be something, like, they need to go in there and start, you know, this is why you need, like a association for the fighters, so the fighters can fight for these things. Because let's say you do go into a fight week, and then you make weight, and then the fight is canceled on the day of the fight, you should get, you know, at least like 80% of your purse, right?
Yeah.
Like especially if it's not your fault.
Right.
You know, it should be in the contracts, dude. Like, they should be fighting for this. Like, I don't understand I don't know what the managers and agents are doing. They're probably not doing anything.
Yeah.
But like the UFC, you know, what I mean, they have the best lawyers. They have, you know, the best of the best
Yeah.
in the fight game, and
Of
you know,
course.
to fight against that, you need to bring in some heavy guns, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like those types of people are not available to fighters because fighters don't make that much money,
Right.
right? Unless they come together, you know.
Yeah, some kind of union.
Yeah, but
Makes sense.
that, you know, we're talking about something that is very far fetched to have a union, because there's like different levels in fighting, right? There's like the amateurs, and then there's like these low levels, and who's gonna be in the union? Who's not gonna be in the union? Do you have to be in the UFC to be in the union? Are you Bellator? Can you be in the union? Can you be in the
Right.
PFL? Like it does. Like it's just, it's the clusterfuck,
Yeah.
right? And in the union, yeah, it's a great idea, but it's, how are you gonna handle all of that?
Right,
Like
and
who
in
gets
some
the opportunity for a union?
yeah, and then in
position?
some cases, right, like these high profile, like high level fights, you know, if there are multiple six-figure paydays, it's one thing, but then, you know, for most of, we'll say like the lower to mid tier like pro fighters, right, you're maybe looking at like a 3K to show, 3K to win, 4-4, 5-5, or maybe like 10-10 in the, I think, introductory contracts for like the UFC and stuff like that, right? It's like that's not like that's not that much money to play around with and fight for, from a legal standpoint. So it's, yeah, it's a bit tricky. Like it would be awesome if something were in place for that, but I think it's not like it's not a problem that's prevalent enough in the MMA community, where like, you know, flying people in for fights and stuff like that is like, that's like a, we'll call it like a top 0.5% of MMA fighters have that problem and not much else. And so so that's the kind of thing where the union would really only make financial sense to like the big dogs in the sport anyways. So that's a tough one. Have to figure out a way how to make that exist that, you know, makes it worth like the lawyer's time too, because they're not going to want to do something like that pro bono probably.
Yeah, it's like when you look at the landscape of mixed martial arts, and even fighting in general, the promotions have a lot of the power, right? And
Yeah,
you could only speak out for so long, right?
definitely.
And it's just you're in an echo chamber. You're not speaking to anybody because people just hear the same shit over and over again, and it just gets old, right? And just like, if you're not gonna do nothing about it, why are you complaining about that? Complaining about it, it's not doing anything about it.
Right.
To
You
be
got,
honest,
yeah, taking some kind of action. But
yeah,
then against like a big player like that, it's like,
it's
crap, like
hard.
what kind of action
Yeah,
am I
cause
actually able to take that, you know, makes an impact?
Because maybe like if Chris Weidman goes out and just fucking goes full, you know, blast on the UFC and just, you know, starts, you know, bombing on them,
Right.
he loses. He'll never fight again in the UFC. Like they could take it all away,
Yeah.
right? They, you know, they don't put him in the Hall of Fame.
Ah.
They don't, like. There's a lot of repercussions of like battling against
Right.
the UFC. Because look at how long Anderson Silva took
Oh,
to get into the Hall of Fame.
right.
It took him a while, man, because he had some kind of beef. Because he said a couple things about the UFC after he left, right? But Weidman, man, and also he does those like shows, you know, those like weigh-in shows and all
Yeah,
this
yeah.
stuff. That could be all taken away.
Yeah. Right.
We don't know behind the scenes.
That's true. He's got so many ties to the UFC outside of the actual fight itself that if he does anything to mess up that relationship with the UFC, some of those other, you know, strings can kind of get cut loose too. So that's a tough career position for him. That like so many different, like presumably he's getting paid for these shows, right? So like we'll say a lot of different like revenue streams could just kind of get stopped because of some logistical like crap that should be in place but just isn't.